Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here. I didn't realize we were going to have such a full house, but I speak to many of you on the phone and see you actually all the time. So thanks for all your good work in a business that is more important and more difficult than ever before. And I will just tell you generally what I think the important goals and challenges are ahead. As you know from having watched and worked with me, I view my job as fighting for the people of Connecticut. Special interests these days get their way more than ever before in Washington, which is frustrating and infuriating me, but I'm viewing my job as standing up to those special interests, big corporations, pharmaceutical drug companies, car makers, when they put people in Connecticut in peril or when they take advantage of them. And so I stand up for consumers when they are ripped off, for women who simply want equal pay for equal work, veterans when they need and deserve quality health care, and for everybody in Connecticut who simply wants a fair shake. And these days, jobs and economic progress are critically important. So I have been a strong advocate of investment. And that investment takes a number of very important forms. Number one, our national defense. I have been one of the chief advocates, and I think effective, on behalf of our shipbuilding program at Electric Boat, Joint Strike Fighter program at Pratt & Whitney, and the helicopter program at Sikorsky. And that has brought thousands of jobs and will bring many more jobs, thousands probably, to those places. But it's not only jobs there, it's also in the supply chain where the components and parts are made. Today I'm going to one of those companies in eastern Connecticut. The components of the Pratt & Whitney engines, the pipes and other components that go into the submarines, same with the helicopters. There's a ripple effect. And the investment in defense is important not only for those jobs and economic progress, but to our national security. I see every day how in danger we are as a nation from countries like Russia and China, which are developing their own weapons platforms. Many of them similar to ours, some of them in effect stealing our secrets, and we need to make sure that the men and women in uniform never have a fair fight, that we are always superior to our adversaries. And the submarines and joint strike fighters and helicopters and other weapons platforms that I advocate as a member of the Armed Services Committee are a powerful investment in our national defense. Second investment, infrastructure. Roads, rail, bridges. We are way behind where we should be. We've made some investment. I've been a leading advocate of the surface transportation reauthorization bill known as the FAST Act, and that will bring $3.5 billion to Connecticut over a 5-year period, including $860 million going to rail. For the first time, incredibly, for the first time, rail will be specifically addressed in this bill. And that will include money specifically going to the Northeast region Amtrak line. Before now, all the profits from the Amtrak line in the Northeast have gone into the general system. We're the only profitable section of Amtrak, and yet those profits have gone to other parts of the Amtrak system. Now we will be getting back $2.6 billion. Again, this investment is just a down payment. It's just a beginning. I propose an infrastructure bank that would be a public-private partnership using some of the money that would be repatriated from abroad. Companies have stashed money abroad. They've parked it there. They don't want to pay taxes by bringing it back. If we give them lower tax rates, or perhaps in some instances no taxes, on the condition that they invest in an infrastructure bank or public financing authority, we can have a public-private partnership involving government bonds that can be sold at next to zero interest rate and private money. And there are trillions abroad. Third area of investment is skill training. I just left Gateway College, advanced manufacturing programs at our community college. Three Rivers Community College has one that is partnered with Grasso Tech, the vocational technical school, and Electric Boat, which is taking members of those classes as apprentices and interns, a combined program to develop the skills we need for this investment. But it's really an investment in human capital. The welders, pipe fitters, sheet metal workers, designers, engineering, electricians, all have to be trained. And the most common question I'm asked by the Pentagon folks is, we're putting a lot of business into Connecticut, we're counting on you, can you meet the labor demands? Will you have the people to fill those jobs? And right now, if you go to Electric Boat's website, you'll see, I think it's more than 130 jobs open right now. We will not meet that challenge unless we educate, train, provide skills to people to fill those jobs. And that's true across the whole economy. And the last area where I think we need to make investment is in a sense, private investment. We've begun this effort. We passed tax incentives for business investment, deductions for investment in capital equipment and machinery, tax credits for R&D, suspension of the medical device tax, very important in Connecticut, tax credits for renewables, solar and wind, but not yet fuel cell. We still have a lot of work to do in providing incentives for more investment. And that's an area where I hope to continue my focus, and also focusing on that investment so far as small businesses are concerned, because they are the major job creators in our economy, and making sure that we also provide some breaks for the middle class. Child tax credit, earned income tax credit, those kinds of measures can really make a difference to a very hard-pressed middle class and enable more people to really to move from the middle class and to have some mobility. I think one of the challenges today is not only the inequality of income and wealth, but the insecurity of people in jobs when they wonder whether they'll have a job in just 6 months or a year, and whether their children will have jobs. There was a time when people would get up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, I know if I work hard today, or this week, this month, this year, I can get ahead. And people are doubting that. They're doubting it for themselves and for their children. And so the combination of skill training, tax breaks for the middle class, I think can help revive hope. Where we need to repeal or end tax breaks is for the big oil companies, for companies that send jobs overseas. Right now they can deduct the expenses of moving those jobs overseas and then keep their profits there without being taxed. Companies that move their headquarters overseas through inversion, by buying or being bought and going to tax havens, Netherlands, Ireland, Milan recently did it. And tax breaks for the big oil companies. Believe it or not, those companies still get deductions for certain drilling activities. And you mentioned in an editorial this morning the elimination of the tax deduction of multi-million-dollar bonuses going to corporate executives, which is a bill that Jack Reed and I have, and we combined it with the Social Security reform. But regardless of whether or not Social Security is reformed and the COLA increased, that deduction should be eliminated. Companies should not, in effect, be subsidized for giving bonuses to their corporate executives. Those are the kinds of tax breaks we should eliminate, along with the now famous loss carry forward offset, which Donald Trump has made notorious. Not necessarily eliminate it, but reduce the number of years that it can be used and the amounts that can be offset, and likewise the carried interest, treatment of carried interest as capital gains instead of ordinary income. Those are the kinds of reforms that I think we need to make our tax system fairer and to invest, to incentivize investment by small business and to help our middle class. The challenge is really not only economic, but it is a political challenge to revive hope and trust in our economy and our political system.
Okay, so are you ready for questions?
I'm ready.
I think I'll get us started, before we get to more sort of specific things, but can you tell us how you feel as the senior U.S. Senator for Connecticut about the outlook for November 8th? Are you worried? What's your opinion now? What's been going on the national stage and Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump? But then I also would like to go, before we move on to somebody else, onto the national security issue that you addressed. But if you could start with your thoughts on the national election.
I'm hopeful that Hillary Clinton will win and that she'll have a mandate and that the size of her victory will help to dispel some of the doubts and fears that have been spawned about the outcome, and that we will come together as a nation. We need to come together in a very bipartisan way to support job creation and economic progress, immigration reform, infrastructure investment, college affordability, the opioid abuse and addiction problem. These areas lend themselves to bipartisan cooperation. So I'm hopeful after the election we will come together, whether it's in the lame duck before the inaugural, more likely afterward, because a new president always has a window of opportunity in those first 12 to 18 months to really take new initiatives. And I'm hopeful that we will see the country coming together. On national security, I don't know which aspect of national security
you said, and certainly, we do see a lot of people here, and we heard from Senator Murphy on some of the issues that he's raised as concern. But you said that you see every day how endangered we are as a nation. And I'm curious what you meant about that.
Sure.
Specifically what you meant by that. I think you noted Russia and China, and specifically, what did you mean about us being in danger, excuse me, as a nation?
Well, that's a big question. And the danger to the nation is from a number of different kinds of threats. Number one, violent extremists, ISIS. We are at war with ISIS. And to safeguard our homeland, we need to make sure that we fight that war abroad to keep us safer here and avoid ISIS or Al-Qaeda having the kinds of bases and havens that they did before 9/11 in Afghanistan. And that means pushing back, as we are now successfully, ISIS in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. Our strategy has to be smart. We need to avoid massive numbers of American troops on the ground. There is no single military solution, but we can help equip and train local forces like the Kurds and the Iraqi military that are making very good progress against ISIS. Hopefully we'll retake Mosul within the next couple of months. And we can provide air superiority, intelligence gathering and sharing, better intelligence and more sharing, stopping the flow of money to ISIS, as we're beginning to do, and special operators in very limited numbers of American special operators. We need to have a strategy in Iraq and in Syria, and in Syria probably establish humanitarian safe havens as has been proposed, and also make our borders more secure, again, a matter of national security, by strengthening the visa waiver program. There are millions of lost and stolen passports. People can come to this country with those passports. They lack any biometric check, many of them, and we can make our nation safer by tightening the visa waiver program and requiring that there be biometric identification factors in those passports. That's just one example. Stronger vetting and screening of others who come to this country under other programs, and stopping the overstay on visas once people are here. The national security issue also involves cyber. We're under attack literally every day. Cyber attacks from Russia, China, from non-state actors sponsored by state are continual. And they're not only against utilities, financial institutions, they're also against our government. We need to develop a national strategy. Again, I questioned some of our chief intelligence officials just last month at hearings that we had about the need to establish a policy of deterrence against these attacks. Foreign actors need to know that we will respond, that we will meet those attacks with equivalent responses. If we're attacked by Russia or China in cyber, that we will have a response. So there is that area, cyber, space, a lot going on in the world of space, a lot of it classified, but these are two new areas of threat where we need to be prepared. We also, going back to the point I was making earlier, need to continue building our capability in more traditional areas. The Virginia Fast Attack submarine and the Ohio replacement, essential to the nuclear triad, which is aging. It has to be replaced, as well as the need for the new fighter, the F-35. This kind of development of new weapon systems has to be done prudently and smartly, avoiding the kinds of cost overruns and delays that we've seen in the past. That's a major challenge going forward. And the war over the last 15 years, or wars, have taken their toll on our military capability. We're approaching a critical juncture in terms of our personnel policies in the military. As you well know, a very tiny fraction of the United States has been impacted by these wars directly. Two of my sons have served, one in the Marine Corps Reserve in Afghanistan, the other is now serving in the Navy, which is the reason why I have a blue star on my lapel. Most people have no idea what this blue star means. Most people come up to me and they say, "Oh, is that the Connecticut flag?" Literally. And that reflects the lack of awareness of our, or involvement of our general population in military service. Now, I'm not advocating a draft, but we need to remember that for all the hardware and all the weapon system, the folks who run them, the men and women in uniform, have probably the most important role. And that brings me to the issue of veterans, which I view as part of our national security. You know, the costs of war are the costs of keeping faith with our veterans. Too often we've ignored them and failed to keep faith with them. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, but I'm also the ranking member on Veterans Affairs. And this issue ought to be very bipartisan, and it has been. I helped to draft the Veterans Choice Bill a couple of years ago in the wake of the scandals and debacles in Arizona and elsewhere in the country. It enables veterans to go outside the VA facilities if they live farther than 40 miles from one of them, or if they have to wait more than 30 days for the medical treatment they need. It also imposes accountability to punish wrongdoers. But that bill was just a beginning, and we now have another measure on the floor of the Senate. It's called Veterans First, which improves the choice program, for example, by enabling prompter for reimbursement to outside providers, and it imposes stronger accountability to protect whistleblowers who were critical in the Arizona scandal, and they were punished until there was wider awareness of the problem. To deny bonuses to poor performers, to remove bad actors, consistent with the notice and appeals requirements that are imposed, as you know, by the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. And it goes beyond just those two areas. It provides, for the first time, expanded benefits for caregivers. A lot of veterans are aging. They'll be cared for by relatives, family members at home. They need support, counseling, insurance. The caregivers expansion is very important in this bill, and so is the opioid addiction program to avoid overuse of painkillers in VA facilities. This Veterans First bill is a big deal. But I also did, as you know, the Clay Hunt Veteran Suicide Prevention Act with John McCain. Some of you have heard me say, again, my apologies, Mary, for repeating something you've probably heard, or others. One of the real moving moments of my time in the United States Senate was to go to the White House with John McCain when President Obama signed that bill. The Clay Hunt Veteran Suicide Prevention Bill provides more mental health care, more research into post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. Some of it's going on right here in West Haven with the collaboration between Yale Medical School and the West Haven facility, and more support for the families. Again, only a beginning. And when I went to the White House for that bill signing, we stood next to the president as he signed the bill, and next to us was Clay Hunt's mom. He came back from Afghanistan, suffering from post-traumatic stress, took his own life because the VA failed him. And in the audience was Joanna Eldridge, whose husband, Justin Eldridge from southeastern Connecticut, unfortunately also took his own life because he suffered from post-traumatic stress, and the VA failed him. Every day in this country, the strongest country in the history of the world, 20 veterans take their own lives. And the costs of caring for our veterans in that Veterans First bill, which provides better health care, more skill training, more job opportunities, is part of our national security. And we need to view it that way and do it in a very bipartisan way. Again, all of these programs involving our national security hopefully will be bipartisan.
I want to ask a follow-up to something you said about the stopping people overstaying their visas. Like, I understand you can make it more difficult for people to get into the country, but once somebody has entered the country legally, how do you check that? How do you monitor them, and what's your plan?
Well, that's a good question. There is a system in place, but it isn't working. And the problem is that the requirements for visa holders to tell the government where they're going or where they are is completely inadequately enforced. So there has to be better enforcement and stronger rules about letting the government know if people move from the place where they're supposed to be, so they can be tracked down if they overstay their visas. The 9/11 bombers were on student visas and they overstayed them. Now, that alone is not the only reason, obviously, that we had the 9/11 tragedy. And while we're on that topic, just as a footnote to the national security discussion, you know, I've been a leading advocate of holding foreign governments responsible if they support or aid terrorist activities, which is why I led the effort on the JASTA bill to enable families to go to court against Saudi Arabia and have their day in court to prove whether Saudi Arabia in fact aided and abetted, financially provided support to those terrorists when they were in Saudi Arabia or in this country. And I think holding foreign governments more responsible for supporting terrorist activities is another way we can send a message and deter terrorist activity.
If I can jump in here, a question on the visa holders. You know, some people who overstay their visas are students, they're workers, they're family members who are staying with people here. They're people with good intentions, people who are building dreams or
Right.
making it possible. If you're imposing these harsher rules, wouldn't that affect them too? It wouldn't just affect people who might become hijackers or become terrorists. It would make the lives difficult for people who are trying to do good things, wouldn't
Not lives difficult. They're here with a visa. Many people come under the visa waiver program. I think there are 30 plus countries that enable visa waivers. So there is no such requirement. If they have visas, though, they are for a period of time. And they're not harsher rules. They're the existing rules. They need to be enforced. And not to make life difficult for them, if the visas need to be renewed, they ought to go through that process, not simply, in effect, flout or defy the law. And if the time period for visas needs to be extended, that can be considered too. But simply to allow overstays without any sort of oversight or scrutiny opens us to potential vulnerability.
Do you think that renewal process maybe needs to be streamlined to encourage people to make sure that they renew in a prompt manner?
It can be and it should be.
Just have a question about Iran. I know you've talked about it a lot and the struggle you had on proving that nuclear agreement. What do we do now? And then people, even who did support the program, are upset because Iran continues to take American hostages. Just sentenced another American to 18 years in prison, I think. Dual citizens, people in Iran, seem to be the big target. What do we do? I mean, what is the response? Is there some response to our economic sanctions or something else for that?
Let me put it in context. Sanctions work. We know they work because they brought Iran to the negotiating table on the nuclear issue. I was involved very closely in spearheading and championing those sanctions. It was a bipartisan effort, but I worked with Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and others in putting pressure on the administration to tighten and enforce the sanctions that are in place right now under our law. Those sanctions expire at the end of the year. I have helped lead the effort for the Iran Sanctions Renewal Act. And this effort, by the way, involves senators who voted in favor of the Iran agreement and others like myself others who voted against it. I voted in favor of it. But Chuck Schumer, Ben Cardin, who voted against the Iran nuclear agreement, are supporting this bill as well. I supported the Iran agreement because it accomplished two objectives. It stops a nuclear-armed Iran, and it does so by peaceful means. If you go back to where we were when those sanctions were in existence, bringing the Iranians to the table, Iran was on the cusp of nuclear arms. The sanctions brought them to the table, but once the agreement was reached, our allies and partners left the table. So when the agreement came to the Senate, there was no better deal to be negotiated at that point. And I consulted diplomatic experts, the intelligence community, military leaders, who convinced me that a military strike would be very, very costly, not only in money, but in lives. And that at that point, our partners and allies were not coming back to the table. So you're right, I did a lot of study and a lot of work, and I concluded that this agreement should be pursued, but that we need to be vigilant and vigorous in enforcing it, and impose sanctions on anybody who supports ICBM development, which the Iranians are now doing, sanctions on not only the Iranians, but on any companies or countries providing either technical know-how or parts or components to ICBMs. Sanctions also are appropriate for continuing violations of Iranians' rights within the country or foreigners. We should impose sanctions if they violate the rights of our citizens who are there. And we can consider other measures, but military action for me always has to be a last resort in situations where we can first use diplomacy or sanctions. But we need to enlist our allies in those diplomatic efforts, and I think we need to make sure that there is surveillance and intelligence through the IAEA and independent means to make sure that we know what's actually happening in Iran, whether they're even coming close to violating the agreement. We cannot allow that agreement to be violated, and we need to take stronger action if it is. So far, I don't want to give away any of the classified stuff that we're getting, but we can be fairly sure that there is no imminent danger of violations.
I just have one follow-up questions on Helen when she brought up it's a story in the New York Times front page today talks about Trump supporters and their feelings if in fact this, if Mrs. Clinton wins the election, people talking about another revolution, which may seem extreme to people who don't share that point of view, but obviously there's a sizable part of the population that's extremely unhappy. What does the new president do? I mean, how do you reach out to that group? I mean, it seems like a very important thing to do for domestic tranquility and just sort of advancing our democracy.
I think that the new president has to reach out in a very bipartisan way to do job creation and economic growth that will assure people that she understands their frustrations and anger with an economy that simply isn't working for a lot of people. Reforming the healthcare system, not repealing the Affordable Care Act, but reforming it so that the costs are brought down doing an infrastructure program that really provides potential jobs for people, good jobs, with the possibility of advancement, and a strong and robust message that we will protect our national security and that we will make sure that America remains the strongest, greatest country in the history of the world. I think a president can do a lot by specific proposals in those areas that show leadership and an effort to reach out.
On that, maybe just a quick one on healthcare. What do you do to bring down the cost? I mean, it's at this point now, people are really getting desperate again
Yeah.
for coverage that they can afford.
Well, the cost issue is multifaceted. Number one, I think improvements have to be made without repealing the whole act. I would not want to go back to the days when women were paying more than men just because they were women for health insurance, or the days when pre-existing conditions were used as excuses not to provide coverage. I know about those days pretty well because I went to bat for people who were denied coverage as Attorney General. And go back to the system that prevented young people from being on their parents' policies, now until the age of 26 under the ACA. So there are reasons to keep the ACA, and one powerful reason is that millions of people now have health insurance, including a lot of people in Connecticut who lacked it before. But bringing down the cost involves more competition and more choices. And if necessary, in my view, expanding Medicare to include people over 55 instead of over 65, in other words, a public option, which will provide more competition in markets. Number two, the cost of healthcare itself, pharmaceutical drug prices, are absolutely outrageous in many respects for many of those drugs. EpiPen, saline solution, Narcan, a number of others, they are just the tip of the iceberg. As you well know, the costs of pharmaceutical drugs have risen astronomically, and efforts need to be made to bring them down. One way of doing it would be to enable Medicare to negotiate prices. The VA can do it, Medicare cannot. And that
How
will,
hard is that to do? I mean, particularly if there's a change in government, if there's a change at the,
well, pharma, the
The
lobbying
science.
arm of the pharmaceutical drug industry, announced a couple of days ago that it was going to raise $100 million to lobby during this coming session. I know firsthand how powerful a lobby the pharmaceutical drug industry is because I've been at loggerheads with them on EpiPens, on a number of other areas where I've sought to protect consumers. And I won't go into all the details of what Mylan did on EpiPens, but to raise prices 600%, and then also to potentially commit fraud against the government in lowering the amounts of rebates. You know, they gave rebates of only 13%, saying that their product was generic, instead of the 23% that would have resulted if they acknowledged that it was a brand. And of course, their contention has been that EpiPens are a brand. Potentially defrauded the government. There's a criminal investigation ongoing now. Mylan said it's settled for $465 million. I regard that amount as woefully inadequate, and I hope the Justice Department will continue its investigation and not close that criminal investigation with $465 million, because the total amount of overcharging to the government is in the range of $700 million, where the denial of rebates is in the range of $700 million. So Mylan stands to get the benefit of, in effect, a sweetheart deal. That's just one example of pharmaceutical drug pricing that needs to be addressed. And better preventive medicine, which is one of the goals of the ACA, but hasn't been implemented as well as it should. The credits that now go to small businesses are underused. We're not sure exactly why, but as you know, under the ACA, small businesses are supposed to get credits for certain health insurance coverage, and likewise subsidies to people who have to pay premiums also could be increased and made more effective. So I think there needs to be a full-scale effort to improve the ACA. Again, not repeal it, but improve it. And certain medical errors. We've made progress against medical errors, but there can be continued progress, which are costly. Medical errors are extremely costly.
Yeah, if I can jump in here, kind of going back to something Mary had talked about when she talked about the Trump supporters. If I can just be a little more pointed there, Donald Trump himself and a lot of his supporters have said, and doubtless you heard this, that the elections and the system are rigged. As somebody who's been in public service for a long time and as a former prosecutor, what do you think when you hear something like that?
I think those claims are preposterous and irresponsible. And his potentially denying the legitimacy of the results, saying that he may not concede, is disrespectful to our democracy. It disrespects and demeans the whole democratic process. And I think it is profoundly a disservice to all of the men and women who work hard in elections. We may disagree among each other, but we respect the outcome. And that's how our democracy is different from those dictatorships where autocrats lose and then they just incarcerate their opposition. And the threat to lock up Hillary Clinton and, again, the disrespect for our justice system, I think there's something really profoundly troubling about a candidate for high office who so disrespects and demeans democracy. And I think the majority of the American people see it for what it is, which is basically an effort to evade responsibility for his conduct during the election.
And if we could stay in the vein of that national level polarization, I'm sure the consensus is that there's a pretty good chance that the Democrats will retake the majority in the Senate. But that is, when they're talking about that, they're talking about a simple majority, not a supermajority, that you'd need to overcome a filibuster threat. If the Democrats do retake the majority, what do you want to see from Senate leadership to overcome this this gridlock that the Senate has seen in the last few years with regard to these filibusters? There is some perception that the Senate doesn't get anything done. They can't get anything done because of that.
Well, I have a lot of faith that some of the rhetoric and the fears at the Trump rallies, and you've referred to them, will subside and dissipate. And that people will want to come together after this election, because Americans want unity of purpose, and we need it more than ever right now. And my hope is that the Senate will reflect that goal, that we will work together more than we have in the past. We have worked together on veterans issues, on national defense, on infrastructure, on a number of other very important areas. But much more needs to be done to eliminate the gridlock and polarization. One area is the Supreme Court. One of the things that we do when we come back, I hope, will be to have a hearing and a vote on the president's nominee. We have a constitutional obligation to advise and consent. The Constitution doesn't say when it's politically advantageous or when it's convenient for you to do it. It says there's a constitutional duty. It's the Senate's job. And I'm hoping that we will have some bipartisan consensus that we need to come together and move forward on a number of these challenges because the country wants it. Again and again and again, I hear from people, you need to work together. You need to get things done. Every day I come to work, I try to reach across the aisle on a specific program or issue, work with one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And fortunately, I'm on some committees where it's easier to do, Armed Services and Veterans Affairs, Judiciary sometimes, Commerce Committee sometimes. We did a bill on ticket scalping that the Commerce Committee overwhelmingly approved, and I did it with Jerry Moran, Republican of Kansas. I worked with Bob Corker on a bill that speeds approval of drugs for antibiotic-resistant diseases. It's the GAIN Act. As a matter of fact, Ribex here in New Haven was the first company to take advantage of the approval, expedited approval process. I've worked with John Cornyn on the JASTA, Justice Against Terrorism, Support for Terrorism Act. I really work hard at bipartisanship, and we all see opportunities that have been missed, and I'm really hopeful that we will come together because, to answer your question very directly, neither party is going to have 60 votes. Bipartisanship is the only way that things will happen in the Senate and in the House.
If I could just ask one more question, and then I'll open the floor here. It's one you might not have heard before. I know you've talked to a lot of Connecticut editorial boards. There's a lot of Connecticut natives, people who've grown up here, and this is their life, this state. I'm a California native. I grew up there my whole life, and I've only recently started working here, and I'll admit that before I came here, I really didn't think that much about Connecticut. Connecticut's a small state with a small population that's kind of overshadowed by Boston and New York. And the delegation, our whole congressional delegation, doesn't hold those very top leadership posts that make the headlines every day, House Speaker and Senate Majority Leader. When you're talking about a national body like the U.S. Senate, when you're talking to senators from Hawaii and Montana and Arizona and places far away and different from here, how do you keep Connecticut relevant? How do you make them interested in what this tiny state up by New York really wants?
Well, we have a great delegation. These accomplishments that I've been describing, with all modesty, I have to say, are the product of a lot of collegiality among ourselves. We like to say, and you may have heard me say it, that we have a small delegation, but we punch above our weight because we work together. We are extremely collegial. Not true of every congressional delegation, as you may know. Some of the bigger ones are somewhat splintered, and California is sometimes one of them. But the other point is that these decisions are made about chairmanships and ranking memberships and all that stuff by seniority. Jack Reed will be chairman of the Armed Services Committee if we have a majority. He is from one of the tiniest states in the whole country. So the decisions about seniority and power on paper, on organization charts, are not made according to the size of the population. Second point is Connecticut may seem small to you, but compared to Wyoming, we have a lot of people. They have a lot more physical space. We have a lot of people. We don't have the oil wells or the gold mines or the other natural resources in the same way. We have really smart people, which goes back to the point I was making earlier about investing. Investing in skill training, the defense industrial base, the manufacturing workers that we have here with skills and work ethic and diligence, that's part of our DNA as a state. We are the original arsenal of democracy. We are the New England innovators, the people who invent things. And so college affordability is a big deal for Connecticut. We need to enable more young people to go to college without burdening themselves with debt that will cripple them financially for their lives, or at least for many years. And that's why I focused on college affordability. And I've worked with Jack Reed and Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren on a college affordability package. It's called In the Red, which enables young people to refinance their college loans. Right now, many of them have 7-8%. The big banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve for zero or close to it. And the government makes money from the student loan program. It's a profit center. Students are producing revenue for our government as a result of the loan. There's something wrong with this picture. So enabling refinancing, enabling debt-free college, certainly at the community college level, enabling more Pell Grants, more scholarship aid, will help Connecticut. There are Connecticut-specific efforts, and I've described some of them. Investment is the key word. Investment in infrastructure, which for the Northeast, again, Connecticut, critical to have more mass transit, more better rail. Unlike Wyoming, which has the space along its highways to widen, I-95, much more difficult to do. So we need more of certain kinds of transportation. That's why I am focusing on this investment in defense and rail and skill training and small businesses and middle class, because it really is so important to Connecticut.
Do you see military spending going up? I mean, you mentioned that all these wars have taken a toll on generally equipment, and there's also a controversy, I guess, about paying military and, you know, the lack of...
We need to be very prudent and cost-conscious in our military spending programs, because we do need to be mindful about fiscal responsibility, about the national debt and deficit, and to do more with less. I can't... The trend is for military budgets to increase, but we need to cut wasteful or unnecessary spending wherever we can. And I've been a strong proponent of the current National Defense Authorization Act, which is before the Congress now. It's actually in a conference committee, and I'm on that conference committee, and I hope it will come to the floor this year, before the end of the year, before the end of the session.
What do you think about marijuana as a Schedule I drug? Coming out of left field here. Do you believe it should be taken off that list, and do you think there's a chance it will be? I mean, half the states have medical marijuana laws, and
Well, I've supported medicinal use of marijuana. The likelihood of marijuana being legalized by the United States Congress are close to zero.
Well, not legalized, but made a Schedule II drug rather than Schedule I.
Well, here's what I think about marijuana and drugs in general. We have an opioid public health crisis in this country. That's where our focus should be. We need to provide better treatment for people who are recovering and better services and counseling so they will start recovering. A crackdown on drug trade, illicit drug trade across our borders from Central America, investing the resources, but we're not going to arrest our way out of the epidemic of addiction in this country. And it really is a public health crisis. I held roundtables around the state, and we produced a report, Call to Action, with 23 specific recommendations. Some of them were in the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, which was passed by Congress. Bipartisan measure, which unfortunately lacked sufficient funding. So we need to provide more funding for treatment, for law enforcement crackdown, but also to make Narcan more affordable because it saves lives, and for stronger guidelines about opioid prescriptions. Connecticut passed a measure, as you know, that restricted the number of days for prescriptions of Percocet and Vicodin and so forth. If you have children, when they break bones or they have wisdom teeth removed, the providers, doctors, often prescribe painkillers for 30 days. And they are used maybe for a few days. There are huge numbers of pills out there, and some of those kids become addicted because they continue using them well past when they should, or they sell them. And so there need to be stronger enforcement of guidelines against overprescription. The CDC took a step, which I advocated that they do, in beginning to issue some of those guidelines. But there needs to be more education. If you talk to the folks at the Yale Medical School, they're at the forefront of developing medical education on pain management. This epidemic of opioid addiction and abuse, heroin, fentanyl, the new, even more powerful heroin derivatives are really reaching into every community in every state all around the country. And it began quite a while ago with OxyContin, made in Connecticut by Purdue Pharma. I sued OxyContin. I sued Purdue Pharma. We succeeded. The Justice Department and other states joined us, and there was a civil settlement. There was also a criminal prosecution. And the lesson there is that education, labeling, awareness needs to be one of our chief goals, because the reason for our lawsuit was improper labeling, and it led to overuse and over-reliance on OxyContin. Purdue Pharma, to its credit, has improved its practices, but the problem of overuse of painkillers is a major threat to our national security.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I heard a VA official on the radio this morning talking about different practices that they want to enact so that they're seeking alternatives to shoveling this stuff out on vets.
Right.
And I'm wondering if, our kids who break bones need to seek alternatives too, or why doesn't somebody just invent a painkiller that's effective, that's not addictive? That's the real question. I don't know.
Well, that's
Well, I don't know about marijuana, but it just seems like is the human brain, wired so much that we can't relieve pain without becoming addicted to it? But the VA thing was what I meant to be.
I'm
really
so glad that you heard that, because we have been pushing the VA. In fact, in the Veterans First Bill and in the Choice Bill, there's money for, there's support for chiropractic. A lot of the veterans suffer real pain. I mean, this isn't just only post-traumatic stress, which is painful and grueling and torturous. It's also physical pain that they're suffering. So chiropractors, counselors, a lot of the therapy involves pets, but the overuse of painkillers can be avoided by some of these other means. And the history here is that the VA often has developed new practices that are then adopted in the civilian world, as you well know, principally in the areas where they specialize: traumatic brain injury, amputees, the development of prosthetics. The VA has sometimes been at the forefront of these efforts, and I think it can be in this area too. And if you ever have the opportunity, you should go over and talk to some of the docs at the VA who are working with Yale on post-traumatic stress, because I spent a couple of hours over there looking at scans of brains and talking about exactly this issue. What is it about the human brain? And at the end of it all, I said to them, so I think what you're telling me is the human brain is a mystery, and we haven't figured it out.
Well, and I know you mentioned broken legs. One of my kids had a broken leg last year, post-surgery broken leg, and she had a bottle this big full of of OxyContin, oxycodone, and I think it was already under the law, so it was limited, but it could be refilled. And she simply stopped taking it and said she was going to suck it up because. Is that a bad? I'm not sure if that was vulgar. I apologize, but that's what she said. But because she was terrified of becoming addicted to opioids.
Good for her.
But it was extraordinary because she was so fearful of it. She simply stopped taking it and just was uncomfortable, so to speak.
Well, I don't know about you, but I broke bones too, and we didn't have those kinds of super powerful painkillers, and we lived through it. And with each of our 4 children, we have said, in effect, you can do without it. And, they lived. So I think that's one of the approaches parents have to take. They have to be involved. And as much as it may seem like a tremendous advance of our medical technology to have these painkillers, they have consequences. And even the kids who are strong, and I've met many of them, we had them at our round tables along with the doctors and the law enforcement officials. We did one at the Yale Medical School where we focused on exactly this issue of pain management. There's a science of pain management now. It's not just I'll write you a prescription for Vicodin for 20 days. There's a real expertise in it, and it needs to be taught, and there's specialists in it. But the overuse of opioids is, I've forgotten the numbers now. We have X% of the world's population, maybe it's 3 or 5%, and we use 85 to 90% of all the opioids that are used worldwide. So it's way out of proportion to our population.
Isn't it true, though, that some of the alternatives aren't covered by insurance? So let's say, like, if you want to manage pain or something, and you want to go to a chiropractor, you're going to have to pay for that out of pocket. But you could get the pills covered under your plan, so you'll get it for free.
Very good.
It's much easier to do.
Exactly. So
what can be done?
Well, the ACA can make sure that explicitly alternatives are covered. I think even now, the spirit and maybe some provisions of the ACA encourage use of alternatives, but not as much as they should be. And there are new alternatives. Friends of mine, I've never used acupuncture, but friends of mine swear by it. And you're absolutely right that insurance coverage has to include those alternatives. And I know you want to get out of here, so I'll just close on this note. What do you want me to get out of here? Mental health parity. I have championed this principle for years. When I was Attorney General, I worked with Patrick Kennedy and Ted Kennedy because Connecticut had laws that required that mental health treatment be regarded as seriously under insurance coverage as physical injury. So the mental health parity provisions in federal law are the result of a concerted effort to make sure people are covered for
Morning, folks.
This kind of-
Sorry. I had car trouble this morning. I apologize.
That's okay. I work on car troubles.
Yes, you do, actually. Yes, you do. Nice interview on CBS.
Thank
I
you.
saw it, yeah.
And I know I'm boring you, but this is sort of, it's a reflection of why I love my job. I worked hard so that the federal law would have a mental health parity provision. That law was unenforced for, I think it's about 6 years. When I say unenforced, there were no rules or regulations. Laws can't be enforced in the federal government if there are no rules and regulations. I was on the Judiciary Committee my first couple years the United States Senate, and they created a committee for me to head. I can't remember the exact name, but it was an administrative rulemaking committee. You can't imagine anything more boring, right? But what we did was we called agencies to explain why they were not making rules to implement laws that Congress had passed. So on cars, there was a requirement that the dashboard have a look back. In other words, in your cars, if they're new cars, they should have a system where you can see behind you when you're backing up. This was a requirement, and there were no rules or regulations. Likewise, for certain kinds of contaminants in manufacturing facilities and other areas. One of them was mental health parity. So we called HHS to come testify on why the rules were not issued. And they said, we're going to issue them, don't worry, it's been 6 years, we know we have to do
We're
it."
working on it.
It's in the 5-year plan.
And we'll have it done. We'll have it done by X date, just, you don't need to have hearing. So I said, okay, we'll give you 2-3 months.
So did the group you were in have authority to make them
We
make those
couldn't
rules?
make the rules, but we could call witnesses to a hearing. And I was the chairman of the subcommittee, and I said, we're calling you for a hearing. And they said, the problem is there's an agency now in the office of the budget office called OIRA, which is supposed to review these regulations for cost effectiveness. So often the regulations will bounce back and forth between the department and OIRA, which is in the executive office. Anyway, make a long story short, we gave them a pass the first time around. We said, okay, do the rules and regulations and we'll be satisfied. And of course, the date came and passed and there were no regulations. We scheduled another hearing. And they said, in effect, I don't know whether there was a second one, but finally we said, okay, you haven't done it, we're having the hearing. And we are calling to testify Patrick Kennedy. Ted Kennedy had passed away. His son Patrick in the House, along with his dad Ted, as I mentioned earlier, championed these rules. We're calling Patrick Kennedy and we're calling your witnesses. And we're going to hear from Patrick Kennedy what he thinks about the delay in this rulemaking has meant. And magically, right around the hearing, they managed to issue these regulations. Now, you can tell by the amount of time it's taken to give this very abbreviated history that this work is not about to be on a bumper sticker. It's not work that easily gives rise to a slogan. It takes a lot of work and a lot of persistence and a lot of pushing. But I felt deeply that mental health parity should be enforced. And still now, it's unfortunately too often unenforced, too often avoided by insurance companies. And one of my missions going back to Congress will be to achieve greater enforcement through the Judiciary Committee. I'm no longer chairman of that subcommittee because the Republicans have taken over, but I want to work to make sure that laws are implemented and enforced. And we focus a lot on new laws. You know, why haven't you made a statute to deal with X problem? But a lot of the challenge is to enforce existing law and to provide resources. Sorry?
What's the point if it's there and nobody's enforcing it?
This is a point I make all the time. The best law on the books is dead letter if it's unenforced. And of course, most of my career has been about law enforcement as U.S. Attorney, as Attorney General. What I saw again and again and again was laws unenforced to protect people, and I would seek to enforce them to make sure people were protected. And very often, enforcement of the laws depends on private lawsuits that people don't have the resources or the awareness to do. That's why, as Attorney General, I champion these causes, and why I stood up against big oil companies, big pharmaceutical companies, big insurance companies, and others. And why I view it as my continuing mission to fight for the people of Connecticut. If it's important to them, defective ignition switch in GM cars, that makes it important to me. If there's a shortage of saline solution, as I heard from Hartford Hospital and Yale New Haven, that's important to quality of care and to the doctors and patients, that's important to me. If pharmaceutical drug prices, like EpiPens, are raised, in violation of the law, through profiteering and price gouging and antitrust violation, that's important to them and it's important to me. And it goes back to a point that Wes was raising, even relating to visas. If rules and laws are unenforced, that creates dangers, as it does for public health and public safety and a variety of other areas. So I think you raise a very important point, that some of the guarantees in the law for coverage need to be enforced more rigorously. I know I've been very long-winded
Not at all.
in response to your...
He makes rules for you.
Yeah, right, they're trying to think about the bumper sticker slogan.
Bumper sticker, yeah.
Getting the rules made.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And I know this has been, a big time for you during...
Well, I hope I can come back. I think I mentioned to one or more of you that I hadn't done this in a while. I wanted to do it, 6 or 8 months ago before the electoral season. And maybe once it's over, if I'm still in office, I can come back.
Right, we are always happy to share, what our elected officials,
Right.
have to say with our readers. So.
Great. Well, you've been very